Hello, welcome back. Today, I'm excited to share with you my guide for feminist scientists, particularly those working in the social sciences. We all know the problem. You have a conclusion and fitting the data often presents very real problems for the researcher. Well, over the last few months of reading sociology papers and feminist articles, particularly those focused on the issue of domestic violence, I've spotted some common practices. These common practices I've collected and formalised, and they form the basis of this proposed set of research methods, which I am certain feminist practitioners will find incredibly useful. So, let's begin. Method 1. Suppress evidence. This at first might seem obvious, but it is foundational, and if not approached in the right way can often lead to issues further on, particularly after publication or during peer review. Researchers should have an ideological commitment and subscribe to the correct model for articulating core tenets. For instance, researchers in domestic violence should adhere to the Duluth model, in which men are almost always the sole perpetrator of interpersonal or domestic violence. It's always best practice to conceal evidence that might in some way contradict this belief. Researchers should avoid evidence that might show any gender symmetry. Thus, the expectation should be that any papers published should include only data on male perpetrators or female victims. Any inclusions that might reference data on female perpetrators and male victims should of course be avoided. An excellent example of best practice in the use of this method is the Women's Aid Report 19 Child Homicides, wherein the authors employed creative selection criteria to exclude females from any consideration whatsoever, thus successfully avoiding any unnecessary complexity in the conclusions. Method 2. Avoid data inconsistent with patriarchy theory. While Method 1 is often successful, it is only useful when dealing with published statistics and data. When engaged in original research, it should be obvious that the best practice is to avoid inadvertently collecting contrary data. This methodology requires that when conducting survey research, questions should take the form of asking participants about attacks by their male partners, but avoid asking them if they had hit their male partner. When compiling questionnaires that conform to this methodology, an ideal tool for researchers is the feminist version of the conflict tactics scales to measure personal violence, as this version omits all questions on perpetration by female participants. This and other female research utilities are ideally suited for use by researchers when employing methodology 2. As an ideal example, we can turn once again to the 19 Child Homicides report by Women's Aid, in which the authors successfully avoided any reference to female violence entirely. By creative use of selection criteria, the authors excluded any inconvenient data, leaving their conclusions untarnished. Method 3. Cite only studies that highlight male perpetration. Researchers have at hand large numbers of feminist journal articles and research papers that have employed either Method 1 or Method 2. It should be obvious that these are ideally suited for purpose. Care in the selection of citation is key to successful and popular publication. Best practice, then, is to confine any referenced material to the product of recognized feminist research. Avoid citing any paper or publication that may contain data that might contradict the desired conclusion. Remember, researchers have a plethora of publications available. There is no excuse for including any citation that might contradict the desired conclusion. A typical example is the Police Foundation report on domestic violence, where the authors managed to include 7 references to Women's Aid publications, thus avoiding any hint at possible male-female symmetry, a strategy consistent with Method 3. It should be emulated wherever possible. Method 4. Create evidence by citation. This is an extremely useful tool in the researcher's toolkit. Consistent, selective citation can very often translate into what is known as evidence by citation, or what Gels 1980 calls the woozle effect. The woozle effect is achieved when frequent citation of publications that lack evidence misleads the reader into thinking there is actual evidence. This makes method 4 the gold standard methodology for feminist researchers. A textbook example of this is found in the book Domestic Abuse, Homicide and Gender, Strategies for Policy and Practice by the feminist criminologist Dr. Jane Monckton-Smith, where in the section Abusers in the System, she claimed that the percentage of abusers within a police force was 40%. Monckton-Smith referenced a study by Dr. Kimberly Lonsway, but when we look at the research conducted by Dr. Kimberly Lonsway, we find that, in fact, the survey was conducted in the Cayman Islands. The Cayman Islands is obviously not Bedford or Essex, but that matters little for our purpose. The important point is that they're all police, and 40% is a statistic that simply cannot be wasted or ignored. As long as care is taken in relation to leaving out tiresome or inconvenient detail, the woozle effect is remarkably easy to achieve, and quite effective in lending our research the veneer of academic rigour, all with very little effort on the part of the researcher. In conclusion, the 4 methods recommended here for feminist researchers is not exhaustive by any means, but they are tried and tested, and the careful reader can detect at least one or more of the methodologies being used in many feminist and sociology articles, papers and publications. To summarise the techniques detailed, they are 1. Suppress evidence whenever possible. 2. Avoid data that is inconsistent with your conclusions. Only use feminist-adapted surveys for data collection. 3. Only cite studies that highlight male violence. 4. Create evidence by citation whenever possible. When used collectively, these 4 research techniques, when used in a consistent manner, will assist the feminist researcher to produce articles and publications that will be well received, popular, and often cited. We end our adventure at this point. I hope you found something of interest in this video. If you would like to support my channel, I now have a Patreon page. If you're unable to support my work through Patreon, then you can share, like, or comment. It's all good. Thank you for watching.